Hello, everyone. My name is Xavier Liogier. I'm Chief Translational Science at the LouLou Foundation, and I'm a neuropsychologist by training. I'm very happy to be with you today, and I warmly thank the organizer for these invitations. It allows us to share some news and update on our observational study that we are trying to set up at the LouLou Foundation with other companies helping us supporting this effort. Let me share my slides and start the talk, which will be on the observational study itself. So, okay. So actually, this is a very exciting time today for the CDD community, CDKL5 deficiency disorders community, simply because now we are approaching clinical trials with very specific potential therapies designed for the CDD populations and for this deficiency. As you may know already, it all starts with the preclinical research that the LouLou Foundation supports heavily, basically, to try identifying the best solutions and the best strategy to treat and fix the what we call CDKL5 fixer here, a good therapy specifically designed for CDD. And as I have mentioned, we are maybe a year or two away from the clinical trials and the first time we're going to test these therapies in the CDD populations. But then the second step is being sure that we have the right tool to evaluate potential efficacy or effect of these new therapies in the disease. And we have to evaluate specific domains that are highly relevant for the disease. And we have to make sure that these scales are sensitive enough to show improvement, but also reliable over time, reliable from a writer to another one, and therefore suitable for clinical trials before testing the compound or the new therapy in the patient populations. And that's basically the purpose of my talk today. I try to give you an overview of what are the current therapies and what would be the new innovative therapies approaching the clinical stage. And then how we, the LouLou Foundation, but within the whole community, how we prepare the landscape for clinical trials. It goes and starts from the patient's community itself and the parents to give inputs so that we understand what are the needs, basically, and also exchanging with the health authorities to make sure that our studies are well designed, but also the selection of our scales are appropriate and consistent with their expectations. And I will finish my talk with the study itself, the observational study, the endpoint enabling study, explaining why we need these type of studies, but also how we plan to implement this trial over the next years. So what are the current therapies for CDD? Well, as you know already, the standard drugs are anti-seizure drugs with limited efficacy. When they are efficient, the treatment effect doesn't last too long. So we need to play with the dosages, also to manage the adverse events and potential toxic effects that are known to be on cognitive aspects, such as processing speed or attention or even language. Another strategy which is currently applied, that's diet, such as the ketogenic diet, or more invasive strategy, which are mainly vagus nerve stimulations. I wanted also to give you an overview of all the clinical trials that have been performed so far involving patients and kids with CDD. You see that all these clinical trials are mainly positive, but also are really targeting the seizures. These are epilepsy trials. And we gained some information from these trials in terms of population access, for instance, and also maybe some elements on domains, because in these trials some questionnaires and scales have been implemented, but these trials are not really specifically designed for CDD. That was also for other conditions with encephalopathies, with epilepsies. So in the future, and potentially in a year or two from now, new clinical trials will be designed for the CDD specific treatments, because we need these CDD specific therapies. We need specific therapies that are disease modifying. This is how we call these therapies that could potentially change something else or improve something else than the seizures. Of course, we want to improve, and that's our primary objective, to improve and control the seizures, but also we would like to see improvement on other domains. Cognition is one of them, behavior, sleep might be another one. And for evaluating this potential effect on other domains than seizures, we need specific outcome measures. Outcome measures means scales, questionnaires, direct evaluation of the capacity of the kids and the patients and participants. And to go through these and tackle these points, we need natural history studies, observational studies, such as the one we are about to start. The potential innovative therapies, and that's why it's really exciting for the whole community, are related to the gene therapies, and that's the first one. Here I gave the example of two different gene therapies that have shown improvement in motor function, cognitions, and behavior in the animal models we have so far for the CDD. Another strategy which is currently being experimented and experienced in the preclinical settings are related to enzyme replacement therapy. So basically trying to administer the protein, CDKL5 protein, which is not produced at the right amount because of the impairment at the gene level. But also other strategies, as complex as the previous two ones, gene editing or antisense therapies. I won't go into details here, but that's exciting because you have different strategies trying to tackle the gene deficiencies from different angles. And again, we are really close to start the clinical trials, so we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared for these clinical trials, and it means that for that, we have, and that's a must, we have to get the patient's community input. What is the most important for the families to be improved for their kids and this type of patients. We need also to discuss with the health authorities and also the clinical experts to make sure that we have identified the right tools, but also that we are designing our trials the right way so that we don't lose time when starting the clinical trials. And I will finish my talk with this endpoint enabling study and giving you more details. Let's see what needs to be done to prepare the landscape for the clinical trials in CDD. Well, after identifying a strategy, new therapies, those I have detailed before, we need to build the tools, the registries, and the trial readiness. This is the purpose of our endpoint enabling study. Building trial readiness, registries, and tools. I will go into more details with the subsequent slides. It's all about the scales, the interaction with the health authorities, and how to design the study the right way to prepare the clinical trials. We have to face specific challenges for the rare disease, and more specifically with neurodevelopmental disorders such as CDD. We have a very small number of patients that could participate potentially in this type of clinical trial. So we have to make sure that we design the studies the best way, so we minimize the burden for the families, but also we make the most out of the data collected. We need to identify the right endpoints and scales. And these scales, this is a challenge as neurodevelopmental disorders, needs to be suitable to different age groups. So for instance, what is adequate for children may not be adequate for the adults and vice versa. We need to identify which one is the best. or if ever possible, to have only one for or addressing all the age groups, for instance. As you may imagine, expected gradual rate of change of neurodevelopment doesn't match necessarily with the duration of the clinical trials. If you have a 6 months or a year clinical trials, may not be enough to see relevant improvements, you know, in more complex domains. Behavior may change quickly, but cognitive changes or improvement may take a bit more time, such as adaptive behavior and things like that, daily living skills. So we need to evaluate these over time. And the other challenging aspects is related to the heterogeneity of the CDD populations. Some patients may be able to walk, some others never. So this is just to describe the heterogeneity. Some patients are more functional than others. And that's why specific study designs need to be implemented, and we have to be sure that these designs are adequate for the purpose of these studies. Natural history or observational study are critical for that and needed to prepare these clinical trials. So let's start with the input from the patient advocacy groups and from the families. This is something, work which has been done before I joined the foundation, by the LouLou Foundation team and others, through interviews, surveys. There was also in 2019, I believe, an alliance meeting specifically to discuss these aspects, and input were gathered from the families from this meeting, but also a specific FDA meeting is designed for this type of purpose, a patient-focused meeting, where a survey has been shared with the families participating into this meeting. And you see, so 52 families were involved in these questionnaires or these surveys. And I just took out from this report the main, I mean, what I consider a very important input here. We asked questions about the symptoms and the activities of the patient. So from families' perspective, what would be the top 3 most burdensome symptoms? And you see that what is ranked first, the global development delay for 80% of the interviewed people, epilepsy and seizures, of course, and gastrointestinal and feeding problems ranked at the 3rd place, for instance, and other symptoms, of course, are mentioned here. But it's really to give us a flavor of what is considered the most important domains to be improved potentially by new therapies. In terms of activity here, same thing, we ask for the top 3 activity of daily life that the kids or the patients are unable to do. And verbal communication is ranked at the first place, followed by independence for most activities and non-verbal communications. What it means to us, it means that we need to have the right tools to evaluate at least these domains so that we are sure that when we give a new therapies, we look into potential improvement in these domains. We exchange also with the clinical experts, psychologists who see the patients almost on a daily basis. They are used to interact with them. They know exactly where are the impairments in terms of cognitions and motor activity. And of course, the pharma needs to be involved because they will design the clinical trials in a year or 2 from now. So we did this, and recently in 2019, there was a clinical consensus, basically with all the experts in the field describing the core symptoms of the disease. Here on the left-hand side, you see epilepsy, severe global development delay, intellectual disability, hypotonia. Of course, it's in a way consistent with the parents' input, but here you have the clinical experts' input as well to give maybe a bit more granularity in these domains that we need to explore. And the last points I need to explain and detail here, that's the interactions we had with the health authorities. So I have mentioned this patient-focused meeting, which is really to in a way, educate the FDA experts and officers on the CDD, but also the FDA has a specific meeting to discuss more technical and scientific aspects, which is called the CPIM, Critical Path Innovation Meeting. So we discussed with the FDA in December last year, and then a follow-up meeting in February, and specifically discussing the endpoint enabling study. So the study we would like to start. We discussed the study design with them, the scale selection, the medical monitoring, medical conditions of our participants, how we could collect this data in an efficient way, and to follow also the trajectory of these medical conditions over time. The last point seems to be a bit aside the scientific aspects, but it's a very important one, the data collections, because the FDA advise on, since it's a rare disease, participants are precious, and we need to make sure that we exchange the information throughout the different parties, because here we are working the LouLou Foundation with the pharma industry in preparing this observational study to identify the right tools for the clinical trials. But there is another exercise and effort which is being done in the US to build a new scale. And they have also their own observational study in the US, and they plan to start this study very soon. And of course, we don't want to duplicate the effort and asking the families maybe to participate in both studies and asking them to do exactly the same exercise, responding to the same questionnaires. So the FDA advice, look, if you have a unique identifier to your participants, then in that case, at the end, you could benefit from all the efforts without increasing the burden to the families. And you could see for one participant who potentially is involved in different studies to get the data from all these different studies for the same participant. So making the best out of the different efforts when a family is involved in multiple trials, for instance. So that was extremely beneficial for us, because from the authorities we could have, it's not an endorsement, but at least a confirmation that our selection of scales were appropriate. Maybe the design needs to be tuned in a way that we decrease the burden to the families, or we put an additional scales here for one specific visit and maybe less to another visit. So that was really a fruitful exchange for both sides, for the authorities, but also for us, of course. So now let's go into more details regarding the study itself, the observational study. What does it bring? Well, it helped researchers first to identify the clinical sites worldwide, and more specifically US and Europe, because that's where we're going to focus our effort for this observational study, to identify the clinical sites able to participate in the clinical trials, able to identify the potential participants and the patients' populations in their respective countries, and also to make sure that we have the right team, site team, clinical team, to administer the scales and the different tests. It helps also the researchers to learn more about the medical conditions over a year, 2 or 3 years, to better understand the trajectory of neurodevelopmental aspects, but also the medical condition itself, medical history, how the seizures, epilepsy evolves over time. Of course, they are treated with anti-epileptics, but these data need to be collected to have a better understanding how the patients behave toward the medications which are prescribed. And of course, at the end, it prepared the whole clinical sites and researcher communities to prepare the clinical trials. This type of observational studies, I have mentioned that already, it also to identify the good measures. So we are not speaking about creating a new measure, but rather testing known scales, known questionnaires that have been used previously in other similar conditions, such as Rett syndrome, and to see how these scales behave in the CDD population. And I will go into more details here. I don't want to spend time on these slides. It's a very technical one, but just to give you a flavor, we want to have a mix between different scales that are administered by the caregiver, the clinicians, or direct assessments of the capacity of the participants. And also these scales you see are validated for different age groups. So we need to evaluate these in different age groups. And of course, it taps into the relevant domains that I have described previously from the input from the family and from the clinical experts. So let's see how it is in a simplified way: quality of life, sleep quality, cognition and cortical visual impairment, behavior, motor function, global functioning, and seizure are the key domains we would like to evaluate over time with different ways. So here we ask the parents and the caregivers to answer questionnaires, going through interview for the behavior aspects, using a diary to record the seizure types or frequency, especially the first year for that study. But we have other tools that are rather for the clinical team and for the clinical experts, the physicians, simply in observing in a standardized way the behavior or the motor functions or the cognitions while the participants are on site. And finally, we have direct measures. So you see we have only two here, 2 or 3 with cognitions, cortical visual impairment, and motor functions, where here we need a highly trained rater, neuropsychologist or psychologist, administering the scale itself to evaluate in a, let's say, objective way, the motor functions or the cognition or the cortical visual impairment level or severity. So all these elements will be part of this observational study and administered at different study visits. We try to balance, or at least to decrease the burden to the families so that they don't need to come over on the sites too often. So here we will try to have home visits, what we call home study visit. It's just like remote visits where the families and the parents are asked to go through the questionnaires, for instance, at 3 months after the baseline visit. So you see you have the baseline visits, which is the first one, and then 6 months, 12 months, 18, 24, and 36 months, we ask the families and the participants to come back on site, and we will look at the differences between these visits and comparing these visits results with the baseline visits. It's open to any potential patients with CDD up to the age of 55, and we are trying to get a maximum of 100 participants. This is a bit optimistic, but we will try everything possible to reach this sample size, simply because it allows us to have a fairly good number of participants for each age group. That's the ultimate goal, knowing already that it's going to be hard and difficult to get adult patients, of course. But that's the strategy here. We will go into US sites as well as Europe, including Eastern Europe, and targeting more or less 30 to 40 sites. Okay, so this ends my talk today. Before finishing this, I'd like to mention that we need a study name. It's like a fingerprint. This is to own the study. This is your study, as it is the one for the LouLou Foundation. And I think it's a good idea to have a nice study name. Here I made a proposal. So for instance, an anagram of endpoint enabling study in CDD. If you shuffle the initials, you have decides. So what I'm going to ask is maybe for you to try finding a nice name, and you send your proposal to my email address here. You have a bit of flexibility here. Names could be acronyms or anagrams, like the Free Science Study for Endpoint Enabling Study in Angelman Syndrome. That was a study performed by Hoffman-LaRoche. And here with the Marinus study, and you are probably more familiar with this one, Marigold, which is just a nice evocative names. So it's up to you. Feel free to send me your proposal at this email address, ideally by June 30, because after that date, we have a very high chance to start the study. So we will make these study names available and known to everyone via maybe the CDKL5 Alliance website. So we will find a good way to share that with you. And the last thing I wanted to advertise on, that's the CDKL5 patient registry, which is currently being settled and set up for non-English countries, but please feel free to visit this registry. It's extremely important to collect data worldwide from the patient's community. With this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and please feel completely free to send your proposal, but also to ask any questions you may believe important. Thank you very much for your attention.